For a brief, rarely discussed period in the early 1960s, George Carlin and Bill Cosby were headed in the same direction. They worked similar rooms, built similar reputations, and were described by the same critics in nearly the same terms. Two young comedians with intelligence and timing rising at the same moment through the same circuit. Most people who know both names would find this difficult to picture. By the end of the 1960s, they had traveled to such different places as artists, as public figures, as versions of what a successful American comedian could be, that the shared starting point had been almost entirely forgotten. The distance between them had grown so wide that describing them as contemporaries who once worked the same clubs felt less like history and more like a story about two entirely different men who happened to have chosen the same profession. But they did share that starting point, and in the years when they did, each of them was making a decision, not a dramatic, declared decision, but the quieter and more consequential kind. The decision about what kind of comedian he was actually going to be. Carlin would make one choice. Cosby would make another. And the distance between those choices, accumulated over decades, would reveal something about comedy, about what it requires, about what it costs, and about the different things two very talented people can do with the same raw material when they point it in different directions. The story begins at the point where those roads had not yet split, in the small, smoke-filled rooms of the early 1960s, where both men were still becoming who they were going to be. The question that comedy eventually forces on every comedian who takes it seriously is a deceptively simple one. Who are you actually talking to? The answer is not as obvious as it seems. Every comedian is physically talking to the audience in front of them. But behind that audience is a larger audience, the imagined listener. The person the comedian is actually addressing when the material is being written and shaped and refined. And that imagined listener determines almost everything about what the comedy becomes. Cosby's imagined listener in those early years and in the decades that followed was broad and inclusive, someone who wanted to laugh at the recognizable, to be welcomed into a shared human experience, to leave the show feeling warm and confirmed rather than challenged or unsettled. That was a genuine artistic vision. It required real skill to execute and real intelligence to sustain over a long career. The comedy he made at his best was not the comedy of comfort in the dismissive sense. It was the comedy of genuine human observation, precise and affectionate, and exactly as funny as it needed to be. Carlin's imagined listener was different, and it was taking Carlin time to realize it. He was, in the early and mid-1960s, performing largely for the broad imagined listener, trying to be the comedian who worked for everyone, who caused no friction, who could be booked on any show and trusted to stay within the understood limits. But the observations he was making privately, the things he was noticing about language and power and the way American society managed its own contradictions, did not belong to that imagined listener. They belonged to someone more specific, someone who wanted the friction, who was interested in the parts of reality that the broad audience preferred not to acknowledge. The gap between the comedian Carlin was performing as and the observer he actually was growing, slowly but steadily. And at some point in the mid to late 1960s, the gap became too large to maintain. Carlin made a choice. He stopped performing for the broad, imagined listener and started performing for the real one, the specific, demanding, uncomfortable audience that his actual observations required. It cost him television bookings. It cost him a category of career stability he had spent years building. It cost him the version of success that, when he and Cosby had been working the same rooms, had seemed like the obvious destination. But it gave him the only thing that his material had always actually been moving toward: the truth. The comedy club circuit in the early 1960s was a world that operated on a single currency: the ability to be original in a small room, night after night, in front of an audience that had already heard everything. The clubs in Greenwich Village, in Chicago, in Philadelphia and Boston and Los Angeles, these were the rooms where careers were built or failed, where material was tested until it either held or broke, where the comedians who were serious about the work separated themselves from the ones who were merely talented. Both Carlin and Cosby were serious about the work. This was one of the things they shared in that early period, and it was not a trivial thing to share. There were plenty of comedians who were funny without being serious, who could get a room laughing without having thought carefully about why the material worked, without having a genuine point of view behind the performance. Carlin and Cosby both had point of view. That was what put them in conversations about careers that might actually amount to something. Cosby had developed a style that was warm, narrative, deeply grounded in the specificity of everyday life, childhood memories, family dynamics, the small absurdities of ordinary experience, told with extraordinary precision and perfect timing. His material was universal in the sense that it sought to find the common ground in human experience, the things everyone recognized regardless of background. He did not address race directly. He did not address politics. He addressed the human, and he was extraordinarily good at it. Carlin's early material moved in a similar direction. His impressions and wordplay and observational bits were not so different in their general shape from what Cosby was doing. Both men were building comedy from the material of ordinary life. Both were demonstrating intelligence and craft. Both were performing in a register that was accessible without being cheap. A critic writing about either of them in 1962 could have used many of the same words. But underneath the surface similarity, something different was developing in each of them. Not yet visible in the material was still too similar, still too shaped by the requirements of the rooms they were working, but present in the private calculations each man was making about what comedy was for and who it was ultimately for. The divergence between Carlin and Cosby in the 1970s was not dramatic in the sense of a public break or declared difference of artistic philosophy. It was structural, visible in what each man chose to make and who each man chose to make it for, in the accumulation of choices that produce a career's shape over time. Cosby moved toward family entertainment, toward television, toward the warmth and universality that would eventually make him one of the most trusted faces in America. The Cosby Show in the 1980s, the decade-long run as the rare entertainer who could reach every demographic simultaneously, the public persona of the responsible, thoughtful, family-centered black man that became one of the defining images of mainstream American culture in that era. Carlin moved in precisely the opposite direction. He shed the suits, grew the hair, abandoned the impressions and the careful wordplay and the material designed to cause no friction. He replaced them with something that could not be made to cause no friction. Observations about language, about power, about the mechanisms by which American society preferred not to look at itself. He was funny, still, as funny as he had ever been, and in some ways funnier, because he was now writing from the place where his actual observations lived, rather than from the place where the market wanted him to be. The two men were still in the same profession. They were still recognized as significant figures in American comedy. But by the 1970s, It would have been impossible for a casual observer to believe they had started in the same rooms, performing for the same audiences, being described in the same critical sentences. What their shared beginning reveals, in retrospect, is something about the nature of early career comedy and the choices it forces. Both men were talented. Both were intelligent. Both had the capacity to do serious work. The question that their divergent careers answers, slowly, over decades, is what serious work in comedy actually requires when you follow it all the way to where it leads. For Cosby, it led to a version of success that was, by almost every conventional measure, total. The television ratings, the critical praise, the cultural centrality, the reach into homes across every demographic in America. That success was real while it lasted, and it lasted for a long time. For Carlin, it led somewhere smaller in the commercial sense, a career that never produced a television show with those ratings, never achieved that particular kind of universal, beloved status. What it produced instead was material that got more honest and more radical and more specific with every passing decade. Work that did not ask to be universally loved and was not universally loved, but that people who found it tended to carry with them in a way that comfort rarely produces. The roads split early. Neither man saw, in the early 1960s in those small rooms, exactly where his road was going to go. The choice was made in the small calculations, what to say, what to leave out, who the imagined listener was, repeated hundreds of times before it became visible as a direction. But the choice was real. It was always real. And following where it led, for both men, produced exactly what you would expect when you take a genuine talent and point it, with complete commitment, in a direction and follow it all the way to the end. Two roads, the same starting point, everything different afterward.